Okay, it's time for a little bit of lecture material, so settle back and listen to this one for a moment. What I want to do here is help you gain a little historical sense about some dominant images we have today, especially the image of competitiveness, which is now a word that has seeped into our language all over the place and in both in the United States and elsewhere. This is a section that I call U.S. Strategies since 1980. The main point that I want to convey to you is that concerns in the United States about competitiveness are rooted in the dominant image of individualism, in a cultural value that we place, that we'll talk about here as individualism. Now, this is important because not all nations understand the relations with one another, with other nations, in such terms. And we'll talk a little bit about how Asian nations, for example, understand themselves in relationship to others. So, being a nation does not mean the same thing in every case as we move around the country. The dominant United States interpretation of competitiveness, however, has become dominant in the world, and yet it is not the only interpretation. And indeed, Dr. Lucena, who teaches this course at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona, is now working on a grant from the National Science Foundation that involves traveling around to some different countries. For him, it includes Brazil and Colombia, Germany and France, in order to find out how engineers understand globalization and international relations in those countries. What's important for us here is that what we take for granted and what we hear all the time, the concept of competitiveness, has indeed become dominant in the world, yet it is not the only one. And understanding other possibilities can be helpful in predicting what sorts of changes are likely to take place down the road. Now, competitiveness. What does this image mean? Remember now, and as I go through this next little bit of material, remember that we're talking about images here. Competitiveness is about nations. I'm not positioning myself here as a political scientist, explaining to you how nations live and work with one another in fact and in historical time. Rather, I'm talking about the rise, emergence, and dominance of images. Competitiveness is a relationship between nations. As such, worrying about competitiveness challenges people to think how they can and should relate to their nation. So what is a nation and what does it mean to me? The basic point that I want to make here is that during the 1980s, the United States, and indeed the world, experienced a huge shift in what we understood as international relations and international struggles, a shift from a military idiom or a military concept or military political concept to an economic concept or theory of international struggle. In the 1980s, beginning marked most significantly by the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and then the rise of the Japanese in the 1980s, coupled with the decline of the Soviet Union during the 1980s, the world experienced a shift from the Cold War to a world of we now just talk about as economic competitiveness. Now, one point I want to make is that worrying about economic competitiveness reaches far deeper into our everyday lives than did worrying about military aggression. During the Cold War, there was always this fear of some aggression taking place, and there was indeed fear of this aggression ultimately reaching into the internal life of our country or of the Soviet Union. And indeed, the recent movie about engineers in West Virginia, young engineers and engineers to be in West Virginia, presented a graphic image of Americans experiencing Sputnik in 1957, when the Soviets sent up the satellite and it was flying overhead and emitting a radio beam that everyone could hear on their radios. It scared the bejesus out of people in the United States and gave them the sense that somehow communism was reaching deep into the heart of our own country. There are a lot of stories about fears of communism in the United States during the 1950s, 1960s, and indeed into the 1970s. But in terms of people's everyday lives, the Cold War didn't have a lot of effect. It had effect in the sense that we built a large defense budget, and we built a military that, after the Korean War, spanned the globe. There was a dramatic transformation of the American military during the amount of money put into the American military during and after the Korean War. But again, in terms of our everyday lives, most people didn't pay much attention. A lot existed under the umbrella of the Cold War. Today, I'd argue it's somewhat different. Today, we tend to assess everything according to whether or not it is productive. Are you being productive? Are you productively using your time right now? Are we collectively productively using our time? The term productive has seeped into our lexicon in a big way. That was not the case prior to 1980. I mean, of course, we knew what the word meant, and we had to be productive, but we didn't constantly worry about it to the extent that we do today. And we also assess everything in terms of which, according to the extent to which we help our nation compete economically in the world. Politicians are forced to argue over whether or not that's good for the national economy. And if it's good for the national economy, then it is arguably fundamentally good.